And there was this little square of light and sky. And this bird came once and sat on the barbed wire. And I could see its belly so clear. And I just like wept. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. And I thought like, and I still try to like, I try to remember that often. Like every morning I get up and I have my coffee and I sit in front of a window and I look at nature and see an animal or see a leaf or something like that. Is that like all the things that we're looking for, all the gifts, all the beauty, all the wealth, all the stuff are like right here, right now, totally and completely. Like if you want to live forever, just get really into this moment because it can last a really, really long time, you know? And
Yes.
so I think like that's something that I really love about traveling is that you put yourself out there to have life-changing experiences. Some of them look differently than others. Some of them are really fun tequila-filled nights that last forever and end with a lover, you know?
Mm,
And others of them are really traumatic. And but in all of them, you're kind of broken open a little bit more
mm.
and you get to kind of see like the great truths that people talk about and write books about. It's not a new idea.
Welcome to the Fearless Living Podcast.
Welcome to the Fearless Living Podcast. I'm Annie Temple, your host, and today we are speaking with a dear friend of mine and also my business coach. I might as well just throw that in there, Amanda Bouchard, and she has an interesting story to share about how she lives an exciting, fearless life. So, Amanda, thank you for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And can you tell me and our guests a little bit about yourself?
That's like such a big question, hey. Like where does the person start? Currently, like I'll go maybe present and backward a little bit is currently I'm you said a business coach, a business consultant. I also do a lot of web design with that kind of based upon the consulting experience. So I've been doing that for like the last probably 10 years. Prior to that, I'm just a serial entrepreneur. My first business was a coffee shop when I was 18. And then I started a nonprofit that worked with people like myself. And then I had a web development company. I absolutely love tech. And then a renovation company downtown Vancouver for 10 years. That while running that, I also opened an ice cream parlor because it was just like super fun and a chance to flip a business, which I really wanted to try that experience of like buying something or creating something just to sell it. Normally, my prior business experience was like I needed a job, so I started a business. And prior to that, kind of, I think the reason that I chose the entrepreneurial path was because I had been in the foster system, adopted twice, foster system, horrible, brutal things within that. And then was a street kid for a few years, wound up in the sex industry. And then when I exited that, which is the nonprofit that I started, it was very much like I'd been paid so much in the sex industry and then going into mainstream employment and the concept of like 550 an hour. I remember the first like square job I got was actually at Shoppers Drug Mart, and I hadn't even asked them like what the pay was. And then it was my first day of training. And just as she was like walking into the staff room, she's like, I was like, oh, by the way, like what's the hourly wage? And she goes, 550 an hour. And I just was like, for an hour? Like
Oh my
and
God.
I just visualized a $5 bill and two quarters in my hand, and I was disgusted. And so I think like that was part of the work that I was the kind of the challenges that we were addressing at the organization that I started is like when it is time to exit for any reason because you need to or because you know you've been hurt in it or because you just want to switch careers, knowing how to go from the kind of money that you make in the trade into like that's not realistic. I made as much as a doctor did in the trade, you know,
Mhm.
is that is finding like for me the secret was finding something that I was so super passionate about. So it's like I could like, I wasn't passionate about the trade. That's not my experience. Other people are. I wasn't. For me, I was
Mhm.
felt very victimized by it. But to go from something that I hated but made a ton of money at to something that I hated and made no money at wouldn't work. But if it was something that I really loved and it was less money, that was a balance I could strike. And so I absolutely love business. Like I love it so much. When I walk into a business I haven't been in before, I'm so curious about like the decisions they're making and like the obvious systems they have in place. And like I'm just always looking at it. And I just really I love the people that choose the entrepreneurial life. They're always like the coolest. And then I am also just very fascinated in like the actual nuts and bolts of a business. So yeah, I would say
And
that's me.
coming from the sex industry, like as I call myself, the erotic entrepreneur, it's like
Mhm.
you were an entrepreneur, you know, out of whatever reason that you got into the industry, but that part of that job appealed to you probably. And so when you left the industry, that you carried that entrepreneurial spirit with you, or at least that's how I felt as a stripper. I was, you know, it was when I left stripping, I wanted to work for myself. So I always had like a side gig of some kind, even if I had a job, you know? So,
Yeah, I think like
oh,
my work, I also was addressing just like what a person's work prospects would be when you come from like, for me, the foster system had a very large impact in my life in the starting and stopping of my life. Like that's something that I don't think people think about or talk about a lot when kids are moved from home to home. Everything starts again, like your bedroom, your friends, your school, you're constantly starting over again. And that harms you as an adult because you don't have like there's things that people intuitively know because it was patterned in them in
mhm.
their upbringing that you're not even consciously aware of. But for somebody that didn't have consistency, you become very consciously aware of how people are operating in this other way than you. And so I think it was always going to be very difficult for me to be like employable just because of that kind of background. And entrepreneurial is very survival. Like, and so if you're a person that has had to survive, and comes from hard knocks, I think like the entrepreneurial world makes a lot of sense.
No doubt. And so I mean, I met you years and years ago. You were quite kind of settled in one spot and living in the same relative area that I was living. And then suddenly you were on the road and you were gone. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
um, my nomadic life. Yeah, the only reason I was in the same place for as long as I was when you met me is because I was still raising my child. And literally, she turned 18 and I hit the road like months later. And I'd had uh this experience when I was very young, when I was in my early 20s, when I was running the organization that I'd started, and the university had taken an interest in people like me that were doing okay, the kind of focus was people that are working with people that they're like. So like for an example, people that there was somebody in my cohort that had started an immigrant society, a society that supports immigrants, and because he was an immigrant. And so like I had started an organization to help sex workers exit because I'd had such a difficult time trying to transition out of it when it was my time. And so they kind of picked these people from that kind of concept. And then, so it was the SFU, Simon Fraser University, and they picked a group of, I think it was 10 of us from all different walks. But the thing we had in common is that we were representing the people we worked for. Like we were representative of the services that we were creating. We were all people that had also were founders of the thing. And so anyways, then they matched us with a group of people in Mexico, in Tijuana. And in what they call, like, it's like these shanty towns, I guess is what we would call them. But what it is where the American border is like when America wants immigrants in because maybe there's a labor shortage or just that's the political climate at the time, they don't really guard the border. They're kind of like, whatever, and you can just kind of jump over and it's no big deal. But when it's like, no, there's like maybe a Republican in office or there's whatever, whatever reason is motivating at the time, that they're like, no, we don't want you here now. Then they start patrolling it, but you never really know. And so you have people that come all the way from the south of Mexico and beyond, like all through South America, and they make this long pilgrimage, and there will be even like whole communities that will fundraise this, like they're, this is our best prospect, we're going to save all this money, and then the community actually like funds their journey to try to make it to America, and they go all the way up through Mexico, and they get to the Tijuana border. And if at that time the Americans are like, we're not into it right now, and they're heavily patrolling, and it's literally like there's either guys with guns or there's not, like it's just so obvious, the doors are like wide open or they're not. This is also 25 years ago, but or maybe 30, I don't know, a long time ago, I'm old. Anyways, and so these little towns would form that were not recognized or acknowledged by anybody, especially the Mexican government, because they were like, you're just trying to leave here anyways. Sometimes they weren't even Mexicans. And so there was no paved roads, there was no running water, there was no electricity, it was very, very extreme conditions. And so there were people in those communities, though, that were doing things like what we were doing in Canada, where they were developing programs and services to help their community. So SFU partnered us with a group of 10 people from there, or I think it was 10 people, I'm not sure how many they had. And so they got to come to Canada and meet us, and we did this whole thing. It was over the course of like a year or two. And then we got to go to Mexico. And this was the first time that I ever left the country. This is an emotional story. It's so weird. I want to be emotional. So we go, and the very first day that we go there, like I'd never seen this level of poverty before. And I literally was a street kid that also lived in extreme poverty. But it was really like extremely shocking. And we went into this village, into this community, and we all got out of the van, and we walked by this little place. It's called a tienda in Spanish in Mexico, but it's like a little store. But you couldn't even call it a store. Like we wouldn't even know it's a store. It's like a little small area, and there was like 4 or 5 bags of chips, and like a few candy bars, and there was like very scattered things. It's nothing like what we would see in a store here. And I was so overwhelmed, and the translator came with me into the store. I was like, oh, I want to buy something. And I was having this feeling where it's like, I just wanted to give people money. Like, I felt immediately like very stressed by the contrast of what we had and what others did there that we were seeing. So we go into this place, and I go and I take all these things. Like, I'm like, I'm just going to buy a bunch of stuff. This is a way for me to give without just giving money and looking like an asshole, And so I get all these things, and I put them on the counter, and I'm all proud of myself. And and the man's talking and asking me questions, and I don't speak Spanish. I don't know. So the translator who's with me he's asking, oh, he wants to know who you are and where you're from. And, he shares why we're there and blah, blah, blah. And the man is like, oh, I want to give her these things. I don't want her to pay for them. And I was like, oh, but no. Like, I don't even need these things. I don't want these things. So please take my money. And I'm trying to pay. And the translator is going, no, he doesn't want you to pay. And I'm like, no, but I have to pay. Like, this is like, please. And I'm like, I'm shaking now. I'm like very upset. And the translator kind of gets mad at me. He's like, you're not listening to me. He wants to give you those things. Let him give them to you. And he was like being very stern. And I was like, okay. So then I take these things and I go walking out of there, and I'm just like, what the fuck? And I stand against the wall, and the interpreter looks at me and he goes, you people, you come here and you think that money is what people want. You were about to let that guy not have the experience of giving to you. You thought your money was more important. You guys are gross. Like, and there was nobody else around. Nobody else could hear that. And it was this moment of like honesty on his part, and I was sucker punched. And like that set me on on this path, through Mexico. Which is
Very
like
emotional
deeply,
story.
yeah, well, not just that story, but then like what would go on to happen. So that was, in 2000 and probably 3. And I've lived in Mexico off and on now for 10 years. And the experiences that I've had there, that's a good indicator of the more experiences I would have. Like that was so true. I had come from, and I notice it every time I come back to Canada too, is that we take everything for granted. Like nothing is noticed. And I mean, there's not even sidewalk. Like when I travel, I live in community. Like I don't go stay in all inclusives or in fancy hotels, or that's not what I'm there for. And when I come back to Canada, I'm always like, there's so much abundance. And yet everybody's talking about how they don't have enough, like, which nobody talks about there. That's not the number one conversation here. I feel like it's, the first or second sentence out of anybody's mouth. And so, yeah, that was, I don't even remember what the question was, but that was how, like, that was when the bug formed. My daughter was too young, obviously, for me to leave. And okay, I'll tell one more story with that. When the trip had wrapped up, we were there for I think 10 days, and there was this woman that I kept seeing who was totally giving me the creeps. Like she was she was just like, it seemed like always kind of there but never speaking, and she had this long dark hair and was older, and I always felt like she was just looking through me, and she was really giving me the willies. And the last day, the day that we left, they did this huge, beautiful event for us where they perform this thing called the Lost Child, where it's so powerful. It's this like huge Mexican band, like a mariachi style band, and they're playing this song, and then the trumpet player starts walking away from the band, and you hear the band kind of like respond in frustration, like, "Eh," like they get a little like kind of annoyed and louder or something. And then the guy keeps walking, the trumpet player keeps walking, and his trumpet gets quieter and quieter. And then he goes all the way out the building where you can't even hardly hear his trumpet anymore, and it's slow and faint. And the band now is just insane. They're just like going wild, and it's so beautiful. And then you can't hear him. It's just silence. And then you faintly hear him again, and he's coming back slowly towards you, back into the room, and it gets louder and louder, and then the band gets all excited because they're being reunited. It's just so beautiful. So that was the performance they did as the send off. And so I'm like in this really emotional state, and I go walking to the vans, to go head to the airport, and there's the woman. And she comes walking directly to me, and I'm like, oh fuck. And she comes up to me and she grabs both of my hands, and she looks at me, and there's somebody with me who's an interpreter, and she speaks to me in Spanish, which I didn't know at the time. And he says to me, he goes, she said that there's a reason that you came here and you're coming back. And I just never forgot it. And so when I sold the ice cream parlor, and my daughter, graduated high school and is 18 and beginning her life, I began journeying through Mexico. And yeah, I've never like really had a permanent address since.
That's amazing.
That was so much more emotional than it should be. I mean, talking about Mexico is supposed to be like fun.
I know, but the whole background, the
It's
whole
beautiful.
story of your upbringing and how difficult your childhood was, and then contrasting that with your trip to Mexico and how, it just changed you and affected you and impacted you. And I love how used those instead of like when that man got upset with you, instead of taking it really personally and like hating the guy for being such a dick. You actually like thought about it and were like, oh my gosh, you learned something about yourself and you grew as a person, you know what I mean? And that was such a beautiful story too. And I think that's happened to all of us. Maybe I know it's happened to me a few times where someone says something and I'm like, oh, and I really learned something about myself. And then after that, the thing, whatever it was, is never the same again. I can't think of it the same way. I can't do it the same way. Like, I was actually on a trip with you once, and we were visiting Gracie, and I was so young then, and I was very apologetic. I said, I'm sorry constantly. And Grace told me, did you know that when you apologize, you're seeking approval from others? And I
Oh,
just was like, oh my God, am I? I had to like stop, like, and it was like we're hanging out and laughing and having fun together. And so I had to let it go. But for like months and years after, that would always, every time I said apologize to someone, that would come into my head. And eventually I learned not to be apologizing for my existence constantly, and to recognize that I don't need people's approval. So that was just, and I didn't even realize I was really seeking approval. She was right, but it was just such a fascinating, and yeah, it's interesting when that happens. It hurts. It hurts when someone says something to you like that, and then you have to actually look at yourself and acknowledge how much of it may or may not be true. And then, yeah, that was an excellent story. So is Mexico the only place you've ever been,
oh
or
God,
where else
no.
have you traveled?
I mean, so like where I like so on the Traveler's Trail, which is amazing, by the way, there's other people like me that just travel the world and they live a nomadic life. And on the Traveler's Trail, there's some people that are like collecting destinations versus other people that are kind of being more, I guess, like kind of sociological about it, where they're like there to really understand the people first.
Mhm.
And so I'm the latter. Like I usually stay in a place at least 6 months or a year. And so while I don't have a massive collection, they're all places that I've lived. And so I first started in Mexico City, which is like just completely extraordinary and too often overlooked when people go to Mexico. It's like being in a small town with 35 million people. Like
Wow.
somehow it's still a Mexican town, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and I went from Mexico, and then I lived in Oaxaca, which is a state in Mexico. It's like the gastronomical capital, but it's also like incredibly traditional. I began studying chocolate, cacao. I'm just very passionate about chocolate in general, and that is kind of it's interesting how like cacao does not grow in Oaxaca, but they have perfected chocolate, and they're known for chocolate. It's kind of like in Italy, right? Like the coffee bean doesn't grow there, but they're known for their coffee.
Mhm.
It's similar in Oaxaca, but the cacao bean grows in Tabasco and in Chiapas. Those are other states in Mexico. And so I went to Oaxaca, and Oaxaca was like this, like it's very traditional. There's like wise witchy women that took me in and would do ceremony, and just it's all magical. That year may not have actually happened, like and then I went from there to Puerto Escondido and Zipolite, which Zipolite means Beach of the Dead, and it's just very remote. It's the Pacific coast though. And there's like when I lived there, there was you had to go walk to a place to go use internet, and it was like an internet cafe. There was no, none of the regular services. And that's something that I absolutely love about my experiences in Mexico, is that like by the time that I wrapped up that journey, I went into Chiapas, and like I didn't have a fridge, I didn't have electricity, I didn't have, and nor did I think that I should. Like at that point now, I had gotten so conditioned to, and that's what I mean about then when I come back to Canada, I would just be like, oh, like it's just so, but yeah, so then I went to Chiapas, which is right on the border of Guatemala and Chiapas and Mexico, and then I did go into Guatemala as well. Um, I was like staying in this hostel there and getting my very first tattoo, which says "Fear Nada" on the back of my neck, fear nothing. And the guy who was tattooing it, which is maybe his third tattoo ever, we heard all this commotion outside, and we go and open the shutters, and so we're on the set, we're one floor up, and we look down, and we're like, oh gosh, there's this crowd of people on one side and another crowd of people on the other side, and they're just having this gang war. And they're like, but
Holy
they don't have any guns or anything. They've got like bricks and bottles, and they're just throwing things to each other, and women are running
scary.
in and bustling and closing their shutters, and this like, and it was so weird that I'm just like looking down on it. Like I was like, oh, it was so crazy. And then as quickly as it had begun, it ended, and everybody just dissipated and went away again. And it's just this like
Wow.
downtown Guatemala is very intense, Guatemala City. And then I went to Panama, and And then, so that's kind of my Mexico stuff. I ended Mexico. I went back to Mexico again just a few years ago and went to the Baja Peninsula, which is, it's very American. It was nice. It was fun. I had a lot of friends there. It was a good time, all desert and cactus and that kind of stuff, but not very traditional. And then I went to Europe and I did 3 months in Italy and then France. And so that was also like very, very exceptional. And then I've just come back to Canada now after, um, like I said, I started journeying, which is what I call it, 2014. So
Wow.
exactly 10 years.
Good
Mhm.
for you. It sounds so exciting. I love that idea of becoming so enmeshed in a culture that you don't need a refrigerator or I can't remember, you said heat or something.
Electricity,
Electricity,
you know,
that was
like
it.
this where your life operates according to the weather, like the sun, the sun is up, so now there's brightness and you can see things, but it's just so like it's just a totally different time zone. And I think it's like so inspiring to know also that I have that in me. Like
Mhm,
to know that I think like we have such luxury here that you kind of almost it could become a fear of like, oh, what if things were taken from you or whatever. I don't have any of those fears. Like I've lived with nothing and it's been some of the best experiences I've had. And
mhm,
so I'm not afraid, I'm not attached in the same way to
mhm.
things because of that.
How were you able to afford to travel all those for the last 10 years? Like, how did you maintain an income to support yourself during all those years?
I'm blessed in my entrepreneurial background. It has served me like incredibly well over and over and over again. I'm very grateful. Like I said, initially, I think I became an entrepreneur just because I wasn't going to be a good employee and I needed a job. So I just started my own and then paid myself a living wage.
Mhm,
But I started freelancing doing consulting. So I had just been running that renovation company full time and it was really busy downtown Vancouver. You learn a lot. The building industry is a lot of moving parts. Stress is something you need to be really super comfortable with. And then I have a very varied background. Like the nonprofit work I did, I raised over $1 million for that organization in like 2 years, very quickly. So I have that skill set. And then the other businesses that I would start along the way. So like I also had a web development company. So I'm saying all that to say is that I was very fortunate when I went on the road. I have a lot of skills that I can market So initially people would have me as a consultant. It was like all brick and mortar places, like actual buildings, places,
mhm,
because that is such a brutal learning curve for people.
mhm.
Is like you can't, like, for example, my ice cream parlor. Do you know I needed 4 sinks inside of my ice cream parlor? You're
Wow.
like, it's an ice cream parlor, but you have to have a separate sink for the mop, you have to have a separate sink for the scoop, and then you have to have 2 sinks for that you wash any dishes in, and then ones that they're sanitized in. And like my whole place was like probably 400 square feet. Like it was this tiny, adorable little, and I was like, how am I going to put 4 sinks in here? But you have to figure it out. So those are the kind of things though that like if you don't have, I didn't have a business consultant, I couldn't afford it at the time. But those were the things that I initially started helping people with, is because I was in the permit office every day anyways with the renovation company.
Mhm,
And then I also knew about and I'd had that coffee shop before, so I knew a lot about the food safe things and the blah blah. It's just so many moving parts, and a lot of people go into business, in my experience, what I see is people go into business because they're really passionate about the thing that the business is going to do. So like they love cooking, so they open a restaurant. Oh God, my heart goes out to them. It's so brutal.
mhm.
But they're really like, I won't even I will not take on restaurant clients anymore because it's literally soul crushing. But they go into business because they're so passionate about this thing that they're doing, but they don't realize that that's like probably 25% of what your business will actually do. Your business has to operate. It has to be a business. So I think You either should go into business because you really know business well and you're really excited about the moving parts of what it means being in a permanent office, knowing what regulations are, like payroll, or just all the things that there's so many moving parts. So either you have to love that more than the thing it is that your business is going to do, or you have to have a business consultant, somebody
Yes.
that will just like, and so initially that's very much what I was doing, was just streamlining people's processes of getting them open. So it was a lot of startups, and then I kind of, as my clients started going online more, then it became kind of web work. And that is something that is very easy to sell when you're on the road. So I did a lot of that. It was, it didn't look the same for anybody. It still doesn't. Like there's not, I can't say like this is what business consulting looks like. It doesn't. Literally every one of my clients uses me for different things. But like I said, I'm fortunate in that my experience is varied. So like if my client needs a website or I need to make some money and I need to sell making a website, I can do that, So but then if somebody just needs to know how to get from A to B in the fastest, most efficient way possible from their business, then I can consult with them on that too. So that's how I made money, like the big money. And then when I started on that chocolate journey, when I went into Chiapas, I was ready to kind of put the things that I'd learned into use. I'd been involved in a lot of ceremony when I was living in Oaxaca, and was learning a lot about the cacao. And so I started doing cacao ceremony,
Wow.
and was able to pay for my accommodation doing that usually,
Oh,
because I couldn't rely on internet. Like the more and more remote I got, it was very difficult to operate my online business. I mean,
wow.
or
You're
any
very
business.
resourceful.
Yeah, it was super fun. It was super, super fun actually. Like I missed those days for sure. But I remember like when I moved there, the place that I was going, I knew I wasn't going to be able to have internet. And I had this decision to make. It's like, do I carry on this path? Because Chiapas is like the chocolate grows there. They drink it for breakfast. It's everywhere. It's just it's the bloodline. It's just runs through the whole thing. If you're passionate about chocolate, you have to go to Chiapas. And so I knew that it was where my chocolate journey was supposed to end, but I knew that I couldn't do my work there. And so like I literally lived in a tree house, it was a peach tree in the jungle.
So
Just
cool.
outrageous, just outrageously amazing. But I couldn't do my same work. And so that was really exciting because I made this decision. I remember being like, okay, like I feel like I'm standing on this cliff and I can make this jump and know that I have no idea how I'm gonna make any money. I'm gonna be completely, like literally very, very poor. But I had at that point been on the journey for like 4 years. And I was like, I don't think I'm ever going to make this leap again, though, because it was a gradual reduction of like when I was running the renovation company, I mean, we made a ton of money. Like my other businesses made a lot of money. I was living the high life downtown Vancouver, being like downtown girl, like I went from that to like, I
Living
literally
in a
didn't own shoes.
treehouse.
And I didn't own shoes. I didn't own shoes for like a year and a half, like not even shoes. So I was like,
Wow.
I don't think I'm ever going to do that. I'm never going to be this close to the edge again. And so I was like, just jump, just go for it. And so I did. So that whole year that I spent in Chiapas in the jungle, there were times that I literally didn't know where my next like dollar was going to come from. I remember like I would go to the market and I would have like just a few pesos. And so I'd be like, okay, I can have one avocado. I could get, two mangoes. And so, and the shop people would take pity on me and they would be like, just have the avocado. I mean, like Mexican people needing to give to me, like
Aw,
what an arc, right?
that's so
So it was
awesome.
so
Love.
yeah, I mean, there's many people that do make money while traveling. You can teach English as another language. I know people are always interested in that, like, how do you afford it? And it's like, first of all, like if you live in community, it's very affordable everywhere. Like when I was in Sicily for 2 months, and it like no 3 months, and the 1 month that I came back to Canada, I spent more money in that 1 month than I did 3 months in Sicily.
Wow.
Like Canada is very expensive, so it's about how you choose to live. Like, yeah, your vacation to Mexico can cost you $2,000, but you could also live for half a year off $2,000 in Mexico if you went to the right
Wow.
place and you allowed yourself to live a different way.
That's amazing. That is so amazing. And did you run into any, well, I know you did. You ran into some challenges on your travels. I've even been witness to a crazy beach event that you went through when you were in Mexico. What was it? You got bit by like, what was it again?
Oh God, I have so many though, like I was like, what is she talking about right now? That was the stingray. That happened
Stingray,
recently.
stingray.
That happened in Baja. And it was hilarious too, because I was like having such a good day. I was like, oh, I'm in the ocean. I'm so happy. And I literally was like frolicking. Like I was jumping up and down. And then I thought a shark bit me. Like I was screaming and there was just blood everywhere in the water. And I was like, but luckily other people knew what had happened. It was a stingray had stabbed me. And it also got stuck inside of me. The sheath, it when it pulled out, the sheath was left in. But anyways, and so blood was just like glug, like just gurgling out of my foot. And
Oh my
what they
God.
do, there was somebody there that had like a campsite set up, Mexican man. He understood what was happening, and he comes over and he's like, he said they had to boil me water. So what you do is you boil water and then they pour it on it. So you're like got literally boiling water being poured on your foot, but it stops the venom from going other places in your body. So it's necessary. And then, yeah, I couldn't walk for weeks. Some people, it's not that bad. Like it depends what happens, how big it is, how far inside of you it gets. Mine was really intense. So,
Wow.
but then I've also been in like, when I was living in Chiapas, there was an 8.4 earthquake that happened at midnight. We were thrown out of the bed. It's like the largest one the country's ever had. And that was crazy. I've been in a number of earthquakes. I've been in a hurricane. There's a lot of stuff that happens when you travel to the tropics. But the really cool thing that I love about Mexico and Mexicans is, if we have a natural disaster here, we're looking to the government. How are they like, who's going to bail us out? Like there's always, if you think about natural disasters that happen here, and then there's like a price tag attached to it, it's like, well, the government's going to give that money or blah, 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 because nobody's got the insurance, blah, blah. That's not the case in Mexico. Nobody's looking to the government to help them at all.
Mhm.
But it means that the community does. So like, for example, that earthquake that I was in, that really serious one in Chiapas, everybody you come out of your house, and then this group of people just starts forming, as you make sure everybody's okay. And then you go house to house with the group of people and assess the situation, and this like larger group forms. And then whenever, okay, who's not okay, who is okay, who needs what, and then you see who needs what, and you go to your house and you get. And so then people bring things out of their house and you put food out front and for like 2 or 3 weeks after any of these natural disasters that I've been in, like the community is just like everybody, and it's a wonderful way to get to know people, like
No
people that when I
doubt.
hadn't really connected with anybody yet, there'd be like an earthquake and be like, now I knew everybody, so um it's interesting. Yeah.
Wow.
Scary, but also like 100% worth it. Like the aftermath of it is so beautiful, and again very contrasted to Canadian culture. Like the version of Canada that I witnessed as a young person was not good at all. I was from Canada's
Yeah.
foster system, and they were literally my parents,
Mhm.
and I don't like it. I don't like the
Yeah.
culture at all.
You
So
touched on something that I've actually often thought about, and I don't have experience of traveling, so I love living vicariously through you, but something I've always felt um, lacking in Canadian society is a sense of community. And I have always believed, not always, but at some point in my life, I don't remember when, I came to understand and believe that it's because we don't take responsibility for our own communities. We don't take responsibility for the people that we in our neighborhoods, our neighbors, or anyone. We expect our government to take care of everything, including picking up the garbage off the street, as little as that to taking care of someone who's, you know, struggling and in some way or another with addiction or with health or disability or whatever. And I would love to be a part of a community where it wasn't taboo or weird for me to knock on a neighbor's door and say, hey, do you need help? Like, is there anything I can do? Uh, I have we have neighbors that are directly across the street from us. We've lived in the same place for 8 years now. Longest I've ever lived anywhere in my life. Because I didn't grow up in foster care, but we moved like every couple years. And so I just had I never lived anywhere for very long, and I just kept doing it as an adult, and I did it to my children. But my youngest is the only one that had like a stable, like long-term living situation, which is the past 8 years. And our neighbors at first wouldn't even talk to us because we live in a community of mostly Indo-Canadians and we're like the white people. And I think like there's maybe a sense of distrust towards us. But now our neighbors smile at us and wave and, it's comfortable. But one neighbor that's directly across the street from us, their son was walking his dog one day past our yard, and another person was walking their pit bull dog, and the pit bull attacked the little white Pomeranian or whatever it is. And the boy, I think he was maybe 13 or 14 at the time, threw himself in the way in between the pit bull and the puppy to save the puppy, or not the puppy, but it wasn't a puppy, but whatever, the small dog. And so the pit bull attacked the child, and the people who were walking the pit bull were trying to get it under control, but they were struggling. And it was right on the other side of my fence from my yard, and I could hear it. And I've been attacked by a pit bull before, so I was in fucking
Oh my
trauma. Like I was
gosh.
like triggered, you know what I mean? And I immediately called 911 and went running around my whole yard because I was too old to jump a fence. My son jumped the fence, and I was like, "Be careful!" Like, oh my God, like I was so terrified, but because I called 911, because I walked over to check on their son, and I also sent like a letter shortly after just expressing that I hope that he was okay, and like we gave them a gift. Like it was just so traumatizing for our family too, but it bonded us, as neighbors. And so now for the last few years, like we give each other Christmas presents, and now they've invited us to their son's wedding, which is like a big thing with multiple days of tents and all kinds of stuff, which it's really a huge honor to be invited. But it's so meaningful when you have neighbors and like community that and you interact with, and it's very meaningful. And I feel like we don't have that in Canada. I feel like in the 80s we kind of did, but now I think technology keeps people just like staring at their phones and staring at their computers, and people don't go outside and talk about, what was on the 6 o'clock news last night anymore, or whatever, I don't know. That's my opinion. But so even as a child, you didn't really get like any kind of neighborhood stuff, hey? Because you were in foster care and it was so much change. Is that how?
Well, and I want to actually ask you something, a kind of a favor, and mostly even because it's like a platform, like other people might see this, is that every time somebody says foster care, I feel something about it.
Okay,
Every time.
that's good to know.
I really prefer foster system
Okay.
because my experience was not a caring one, and I know a lot of people that that's true for. And I think it's good branding on the part of the government, but it's
No
not
doubt.
accurate, and they even abbreviate and call it care. And it's like, that's not what happened though, like at all.
No
So
doubt.
I just wanted to say that.
That's really interesting that you say that, because I worked in an organization that helped kids who were transitioning, turned 18 and were transitioning out of the system. And no one ever brought like no like it was like you say, the other word was just used very commonly, and that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. Thank you for educating me on that. And I feel like it's something we should educate a lot of people about, you know?
Yeah. I think that with the stuff that you said about like the difference for Canada and community and that kind of stuff, what I actually feel is that kind of puts like a bit of a responsibility on the individual Canadian, where I actually think it's like capitalism, to be honest with you, because um, for example, like those places where when I started getting most connected, like to community and being the most included, was when I like stopped wearing makeup, stopped wearing jewelry, didn't talk about what my job was first or my accomplishments.
Mhm.
It's when I like allowed myself to be much more humble. And I think like we're really obsessed in Canada and the US with being better than somebody, right? And so that actually is for me where it starts, is that if you believe you're better than anybody else, you're not a good community member, anyways. And we do that in the most subtle ways, like a nicer car or a bigger ring on your finger, or the idea that when you go to something special, you need to show off, instead of letting it be about somebody else. So I actually think that there's um, that we've been conditioned to do that because it's financially beneficial for corporations and large companies. Is that
Mm,
if we believe, like, just the idea that I should try to look better than you or
mhm.
have more than you already makes me a bad community member,
And also how that impacts people who have less and how it makes them feel like they're not as good or not as worthy or
Yeah.
not as equal because they don't have.
And then it changes those people. Like I've known people that are like that come from like hard knocks is same as I do. And then when they get stuff, they become like the worst offender, even where you're like, how come you're such an asshole? Like, what the game is. Like,
Oh God.
what, how did you forget? And adults do that with kids too. Like I remember when I was a kid that I would be like, I was always curious about what is the age when you stop being a young person and being an old person. When do you stop understanding our perspective? Like I was like, I remember being curious, like, are you aware when it happens? Like how we just can't have the perspective of youth. And I think that's anyway. So I think like if you feel like you want to have a better sense of community, it starts with like an agreeing to have less, I guess, and not trying to be better than other people. And then I think too that yes, in my experience growing up in the system, I didn't live in a single home where I wasn't abused. And it was just a matter of what form the abuse took. The last home, it was sexual abuse. The home prior to that one, those are the two that I was adopted at. So I was in both those homes for 4 years, 4.5 years. The other one, it was like very deep psychological abuse, like had to sleep in the bathtub, locked in rooms, like really weird things, bad things. And so there was no neighbors. Like well, I wasn't gonna get to, there was neighbors, but like I wasn't gonna get to hang out with them.
Yeah.
When you've got kids in the system that are being abused or being mistreated, they're not introduced to other people either. And I think that like it was really liberating for me to know, and why I think other people that have been through similar circumstances as me might find this to be true too, in if they travel or journeying is what I like calling it. I'm not just going to collect stamps.
Mhm.
I'm really wanting to see how other people live and immerse myself in their culture and learn from them. Is
Mhm.
that it kind of helps to put the rest in perspective. Like you're like, oh, okay, that was just like a Canadian thing. That's not like all people things.
Mhm.
Or that like, so I really have enjoyed greatly learning. I feel comforted knowing that not everybody doesn't operate this way. Like there are places in the world where you don't separate old people from young people and dogs can't go in here and
Mhm.
in Mexico, everybody's together like all the
Yeah.
time. There's not this segregation, and we have this segregation in our culture, and a lot of it is based on status. Like it's a bad thing if you're living at home with your parents. Why can't you get your shit together? Go live alone in an apartment. And it's the oddest thing in the world when you look at an apartment building, and I've lived in them, like I'm from downtown Vancouver.
Me too.
When you look at an apartment building, you see all these windows, and then there's these people inside living these lives, and there's this tiny wall separating them, and they don't even know each other's name, and they're living full lives right next to each other, like inches apart, and they may never meet. It's wild.
Very true. Except in the elevator. Yeah, that is so true. So, what did you learn from all of your experience? I mean, you've taught us a lot, actually. You've learned a lot, but is there something else that you'd like to share about what you've learned?
um I think like I'm just deciding whether to like tell this story or not. There's this, I shared a little bit of it with you the other day when I was talking about this experience that I had where I learned to spend the day with somebody in my mind. Remember I was telling you about that? And
Mhm.
I had this experience in Mexico, which like I hesitate to talk about it sometimes because I don't want people to think it's reflective of Mexico, because it's not. It's reflective of people that did bad things, which those exist literally everywhere. And Mexico gets a really bad rap. So, um, but I did have an experience where I was held captive for 37 days, and it was
Mm.
really scary. And I was very sure I wasn't going to leave there. I was very sure actually that. And so where the first few days I was like just in terror and freaking out, then this like kind of calm came over me because I accepted that I was gonna die, like that this was gonna be the last things that I saw or that I did. And then time became like incredibly precious. And it's like one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. And I've had a few.
Mhm.
So the bar's high.
No doubt.
However, in this experience, I and this is something that relates to the whole concept, I think, of traveling and experiencing other places and not being obsessed with having so many things, is that like when I thought that my life was going to be over soon, like every second was really long. And like this one time this bird came, like I was in this like white room, and there's what's it called, the bar stuff, so you can't, what's that called, the chain, no, not chain link, like where it's wound and there's spikes on it.
Oh, okay.
Anyways,
Chain
very, very
link?
tall.
Ah.
No, not chain link, like it's the stuff they do for security, like in a prison they'll have it
Oh,
at the
yeah.
top so that people can't escape.
Mhm.
And there's this little square of light and sky, and this bird came once and sat on the barbed wire, and I could see its belly so clear, and I just like wept. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. And I thought like, and I still I try to remember that often. Like every morning I get up and I have my coffee and I sit in front of a window and I look at nature and see an animal or see a leaf or something like that. Is that like all the things that we're looking for, all the gifts, all the beauty, all the wealth, all the stuff are like right here, right now, totally and completely. Like if you want to live forever, just get really into this moment because it can last a really, really long time, And
Yes.
so I think like that's something that I really love about traveling, is that you put yourself out there to have life-changing experiences. Some of them look differently than others. Some of them are really fun tequila-filled nights that last forever and end with a lover,
Mhm.
and others of them are really traumatic. And but in all of them, you're kind of broken open a little bit more,
Mhm.
and you get to kind of see like the great truths that people talk about and write books about. It's not a new idea, but I feel really grateful that through allowing myself to be so vulnerable, because you are like, you're very vulnerable when you travel. I've always been a single traveler. I've never done it with somebody else. It's always just been me.
Mhm.
And obviously I'm a woman, and it's very vulnerable. But when you are that vulnerable, when you allow yourself to be really vulnerable, when you put yourself in places that where you don't know, like you don't know how to connect a phone, you don't know how to like, why does nobody have a fridge? Nobody has a fridge. Well, how am I gonna keep this thing chilled? It doesn't need to be chilled. What? I thought milk always needs to be chilled. No, it's like, like there's, anyways, is that when you put yourself out there like that and allow yourself to be really vulnerable, that I think like the truths of the world are revealed to you, that you're rewarded for it. So, and then I also, one other thing to add to that is that there's this thing like amongst travelers where it's like you have to be careful for how long you stay still for, like especially when you go back home or to your home country. because for some reason, the more time that you spend, the harder it gets to get on the plane again. And it reminds you of why other people aren't living this life. Because if you ever sampled that experience that I've had of journeying through the world, you would do it too. Like it's addictive, it's endless joy, and like constant learning and evolving. But it is and it's the same as starting a business, is like you can plan it to death. I don't do a lot of startup anymore, but I used to, and you would just plan, 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 plan. And then like probably a third of them don't ever do it. And it's the same with people that say they're going to travel. They have this, they're going to one day. Everybody will tell me this when they, hear my story or like what I do, the way that I live. And they all have a trip in them that they want to share with me. And it's like, you gotta just get to the airport. You just gotta get on the plane, get the fuck out the door, pack your suitcase and go. For me, the leaving is always the hardest, even if it's like leaving my country to go to another one, or when I'm in that country, knowing like I'll get the bug, I'll get the itch. I'll be like, okay, I've been here a year. I know now, I know the community, I know the people, I need to carry on. And it's always gut-wrenching and hard and difficult. And it's same as true in business, is that at the end of the day, you have to take the leap. You can't plan it. It's not, you can't prepare enough for it. You just have to do it.
Wow. I feel like I've been through an experience just interviewing you on this podcast. You totally like, wow, I love your story. It's so beautiful. Thank you for being so fucking vulnerable and sharing your
I'm so
heart.
surprised how emotional it was. It's like, I don't feel like
I have so
talking
many questions for
traveling.
you that I'm not going to ask on here because I don't know if you want to share, but I'm going to ask you in person and then maybe have a future podcast. But yeah, like, wow, and I can relate to what you were saying about when you accept that this could be your last days or last moments. Uh, I've been there. I know that feeling, and I know it was a completely different situation for me. Mine was with my health, but
Yeah.
just accepting that I could die was such a transformative experience, and it's changed me in every way for the rest of my life. And then the story about the bird, and this is totally completely different, but like what it reminded me of for me was like being grateful for the things that I took for granted before. And so like when I was really sick, I couldn't walk upstairs anymore. I had like so much chronic pain in all the joints of my body that I sometimes couldn't even turn a door handle. And my kids would have to help me get dressed. And when I started to heal from the arthritis, like the first time I walked up a set of stairs with no pain, I literally cried. And it's been like, now that was about 2015 or 2016. And so it's been like 8 years or more. And for several years, every single time I walked up the stairs, I was so like grateful. Was so grateful I could walk up some stairs. Like it was just the feeling was so strong, and I would be moved and I would feel teary so often, like, and it lasted for years. And now I'm kind of taking it for granted again, but I'm still reminded, every time I walk up a set of stairs, there is this part of me that remembers when I couldn't do it before, and it's just so incredible how the things that you take for granted, once you lose them, and then if you do get them back, like, but it's just, yeah, it's such a crazy experience being human.
Oh, truly. I wonder what it's like to be a bird.
Right? Me too.
Or a tree. I can't remember. There's some beautiful quote or saying about that. But about something like I don't know. I can't even try to come up with it, but sometimes I'm really fascinated by the longevity of a tree, how like it just sits there. Like if you feel like you're having a hard time in meditation, imagine being a tree.
No doubt. No doubt. Oh, that would be a good way to try meditation, is to imagine I'm a tree. Maybe it would help me. Because I really struggle with sitting still for long periods of time. in the quiet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And you know, one other thing I'm going to say, just because I know we're going to wrap up soon, and people might have it might attract travelers or whatever, might be curious about this, but this is something a little PSA that I like to do about Mexico for people is that all inclusives are really, really hard on that country. And it's one of the most violating things you can do to Mexico is to go to an all inclusive. When you go to communities that are close to all inclusives and talk to the locals about the decimation of their local economy because of it, you'll have like, you know, little boutique hotels that used to be very vibrant that are just don't exist anymore. And even more importantly is that those all-inclusives discourage tipping, where before, like if you go and stay in a community, you're going to go to different restaurants and spread your tourism dollars around. You're going to tip people, and so now these people, though, it's their only place that they can work is these all-inclusives because all the other small businesses have been taken down. The food that is in the all-inclusives is not Mexican food at all. You've not experienced Mexico if the only places you've been is an all-inclusive. I just really beg people, and people think that it's a safety thing. I assure you, the places that have the all-inclusives are much more targets for narco and other type of crime in Mexico because of the discrepancy of the amount of wealth that is existing in the same place as the extreme poverty. If you go to just a regular village or community, that discrepancy doesn't exist. And so there's next to none of those issues. Like I didn't experience those kind of issues. And even the one that I did, it was a certain set of circumstances. It was not, you know, it didn't happen while I was living in a small
Not
village.
like a
So
typical thing that happens.
it was, and it was like literally my bus was pulled over and yeah, it was, but that's just something I really want people to know is
Where
that
would you
you
suggest that people go, or how would people
go to
if
an
they're doing their
Airbnb,
research?
like
Where should they go, or who should they contact, or how should they figure out where to go in Mexico? And
Airbnbs are so great now that they exist. They didn't when I started traveling, but then you like Mexican people are just the best people on earth. I love them dearly, their culture and their disposition. And so if you go stay in an Airbnb, you immediately get a Mexican host who's going to take such good care of you because they really do. They take hosting to a whole other level. So I would right away say it's much easier now. But what I used to do, and I did this when I was in Europe, is I will go to a place and book my first week in a hotel in like the one that's like the most centrally located, looks the most where I'm going to feel the most comfortable right away. Just go to a hotel. And then this is very good if you're a solo traveler because you're more approachable if you're a solo traveler. But in cultures like Mexican cultures or places where people are so, this didn't work in Sicily because they are not outwardly friendly like that. You just get invited. So I would go to a place and I would book my first week and then just start saying yes. You know, when they invite you, somebody will invite you to their kid's birthday or to somebody's wedding, or and if you say, hey, you know, I'm here in the hotel for another few days and I'm thinking about, you know, I'd like to stay longer. I'd like to stay a few months. Do you know anybody who's got a room or anybody who's renting an apartment or, and you ask like the people that work at the hotel, the people that you meet along the way while you're there in that first weekend, always, I never needed it for more than a week, you know? So just show up, just get there. And then once you're there, say yes to the invitations that you receive because you will receive them. Everybody does, any age, any gender. You
And in
know,
terms of like what, say you set aside a certain amount of money that you would normally spend on an all-inclusive, would that be the enough money to go somewhere else? Or would it be more expensive or less expensive?
I stayed in the all-inclusive once. I'm really embarrassed to say it. I was before I knew enough about Mexico to know how horrible it is. And I think it cost us $2,500 in the Maya Riviera for like 4 or 5 days. I mean, you could have such an excellent experience for $2,500 in Mexico. You wouldn't need that much at all. Um, you know, like if you go to like some of my favorite places are like Puerto Escondido, Zipolite, Chiapas, Oaxaca. When you go to those places, you can easily, if you have a budget of 100 or two a night, stay in a beautiful, lovely place, and the people will take such good care of you. Like it's such a different culture there. They really look out for you. I think like yeah, anyways, and you get to have actual Mexican food instead of Tex-Mex.
Awesome. For
Yeah.
people with food considerations, like for me, I can't eat anything with gluten. Do you think that it's difficult to live
Mexico's
there?
perfect.
Is
That's
it?
also why you shouldn't go to an all-inclusive, because the all-inclusives always have the flour tortillas, which is traditional in the northern part of Mexico, so near the States is why. But corn tortillas, the mice, all through Mexico, like in Oaxaca, there's ones that are blue, red, yellow, and I've learned how to make them too. And it's just they just sit there patting the tortillas, and it's all corn. There's no gluten in that. And also, I'm vegetarian. I have been my whole life. And being vegetarian in Mexico is such bliss because the produce is just falling off trucks. It's everywhere. It's growing everywhere. There's so much produce there, just everywhere. And it's like never been contaminated or GMO'd or blah, blah, blah. You
Wonderful.
can go to a grocery store, but grocery stores are very expensive there in comparison. But there's always markets, which is something we don't have in Canada, which sucks. But markets in Mexico are such a beautiful experience, and it's incredibly cheap, and it's insanely good. I mean, it's like having a tomato in Italy, have your vegetables in Mexico. It's your banana, your oranges and your mangoes and your limes and all that stuff.
So if
Yeah,
someone
produce
gave
is
you
really abundant.
$10,000 right now, would you go to back to Mexico for a year?
No, the reason that I'm not, I said my final farewell to Mexico. So that experience that happened, those 37 days, they ended with me being returned to Canada, thankfully. But I hadn't been planning on returning to Canada. But I did. And so I didn't leave on my own terms at all. It was extremely traumatic. And so I went back to Mexico. I stayed in Canada for a year, kind of got grounded, did some healing. And then I went back to Mexico specifically because I didn't want to be afraid of Mexico. I knew that that experience was isolated. I knew it wasn't reflective of Mexico, but I was worried that if I didn't go back that it would taint it. This 1 month and a half experience would overwhelm at that point 8 years. And so I went back to Mexico, and then this time when I left, I stayed for like almost 2 years, and I left, and I really feel like it was my final
Mhm.
goodbye from there, but it was so beautiful. Like, I spent really good quality time with the people that I love there, and it just had I mean, actually, like the jumping around in the ocean was part of the farewell, Of
Mhm.
course I got stung. But all that to say is that what an amazing spiritual riching experience I had being in Mexico. But no, there's other places that I want to live. So
That
New
was going to
York,
be my next question. Where
Hungary,
do you want to go next?
And Ireland are the places that I all want to live in. So I think New York probably will be next. I'm relocating to the island for a little bit to spend some quality time with my grandkids. Got two grandkids. Thankfully my daughter gave me them. Well, I get to share them. I don't have them. I get to play with them, and they're
She
really
didn't
cool.
literally hand them over to you.
Yeah. No, they would never. Her and her husband are wonderful parents.
What a
But
blessing.
I'm gonna go spend the summer with them. And then actually, interestingly enough, I had to say goodbye to my best friend, my dog companion. Oh, this is another little trick for people. Don't let when I began traveling Mexico, I took my dog and my cat with me. And man, and I had my dog with me the whole time when I was in Mexico. I never didn't have my dog. And she's a little Shih Tzu, so it wasn't protection. But when you travel with an animal, because that'll be an excuse people give, right? Oh, but I've got, it's always one of the thing, oh, but I got a dog, I'll have to find a dog sitter. I can only go for a week or two. The places that you experience when you have a dog, because there's places that won't let you, but there's places that will. And so it was really sad to say goodbye to her. She lived to 17 years old just a few months ago. I was like, will I ever travel again? Because she's always led the way. It's like, okay, I booked that flight because that airline allows dogs. I booked that accommodation because that place allows dogs. I started working at that hostel because they allowed dogs. Like when I moved into the jungle, I was the only white girl for anywhere. There was not other white people there. And so everybody was kind of like, nobody really talked to me. But my little dog, her name's Ferocious. My little Shih Tzu is so cute. She's like a living teddy bear that kids would just come running after her, and the parents would like not be comfortable saying hi to me, but the kids would just gravitate and hang out with the dog. And then I'd meet the kids, and then the kids would introduce me to the parents. And then I was finally part of the community. So traveling with an animal is a wonderful way to experience traveling because she formed the path for me for sure. So it will be really
Does
weird
she sit with you on the plane, or does she go into like a cargo area?
She gets to sit on the plane because she's a Shih Tzu. She's a little one.
Yeah, that's
Oh, right. This was the story I was gonna tell that. So I want to get her paw tattooed on my palm. I can like
wow.
put it near my heart. And but I can't find anybody here to do it because I don't know, people are really stuffy about their tattoos here. It's like, oh, it'll fade or I don't know. They're so artsy about it. Me, I'm like very like get a needle and tattoo me. So I'm gonna do a journey in the fall to Guatemala again because there's not the same tattoo artist, an actual tattoo artist who does the traditional tattooing. And he's gonna do it for me. And I'm gonna go for Dia de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead. And there's 2 days for that. One is for the kids, one is for the adults. And it's, when they believe that Muertos is so cool. It's like you set up an altar and you put the things that are meaningful on the altar that represent the person who passed away that you want to have come visit you. And what's really cool is that this is so different than Canadian culture, the way that we shame everybody for their vices. There, it's like your vices are character traits of you. They're a way to represent you. And so on the altar, like if you smoke, there'll be a cigarette. If you loved drinking, there'll be booze. And then they consume it. So even if you're not a person that drinks, you're going to take a shot because that's the only way the spirit's going to come hang out with you. You're going to call them with their vice. I love it. It's so good. But so the day before that is for the kids that have passed. And so we're going to do the ceremony. He does a ceremonial tattoo and he's going to do it on that day. So that will be really special. So that will be my next trip. And then we'll see from there. But I think probably New York.
Well, wow. Thank you so much. I loved all your stories and I can't wait I hope that you will come back to the Fearless Living podcast again because you are very fascinating and have a lot of wisdom to pass on. I really enjoyed chatting with you and thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.